So I think people are still connecting, but we can already start perhaps with a warm welcome to everyone to another open seminar of our Princeton Byrne Research Initiative Interactive Histories Co-Produced Communities, in which we attempt to explore moments of co-production in the entangled histories of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. We seek to understand better how these three religious traditions have continuously formed, reformed, and transformed by interacting with and thinking about one another. And I think very few scholars have contributed as much to the understanding of the interrelation between the Quran and the Bible as our today's speaker, Professor Gabriel Reynolds. So we are very proud and grateful that you accepted our invitation to give a lecture on the Quran as theological engagement with Christianity. And I hand over to our postdoctoral researcher, Paul Neuenkirchen, to briefly introduce Professor Reynolds.
Thank you, Katharina. Today, we have the great pleasure and immense honor of welcoming Gabriel Reynolds, who is Professor of Islamic Studies and Theology at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Gabriel Reynolds has been working on early Islam and the Quran for over 2 decades now, focusing on the relation between Jewish and Christian textual traditions and the Quranic text, as Katharina just mentioned. His work has had a profound impact on my own research since my early days in Islamic studies, as it has on many of my colleagues as well. In addition to his many scientific articles, Gabriel Reynolds has edited 2 groundbreaking volumes on the Quran, which are The Quran and its Historical Context, back in 2008, and New Perspectives on the Quran in 2011. He's also published a revised annotated translation and commentary of the Quran entitled The Quran and the Bible, Text and Commentary. That was in 2018. And he has authored several important monographs, among which The Quran and its Biblical Subtext in 2010, and more recently, a book entitled Allah, God in the Quran in 2020, in which he engages with the Quran through the lenses of comparative theology. Staying in this theme, for today's 6th Co-Produced Religions Zoom seminar, Gabriel Reynolds will be talking about the Quran as theological engagement with Christianity. And with that, Gabriel, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Can you hear me okay? Okay, terrific. Yeah, thank you also, Katharina. And thank you, Nicole. Thanks to all for the work you've done in preparing this, and especially for the honor of the invitation. It's really good to see all of you, and good to see some old friends. Thank you for coming. I hope you won't regret it. I'll speak for about 45 minutes, if that sounds right. Katharina, is that good? About 45 minutes? Okay. Yeah, I'll speak for about 45 minutes on the theme which Paul introduced. And I'll have a PowerPoint, and then I look forward to your thoughts and critiques during the discussion afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Great. Okay. So, and Paul, you can see this? Yes? Okay. Terrific. Excuse me. So, friends, this is a rather simple talk, which is connected to a current monograph project in which I think about the Quran engaging with Christianity in particular. And there's a historical element to this research project, in as much as I'm trying to learn from the work of those who have studied the pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions, from what we can tell of the religious milieu of the Arabian Peninsula at the dawn of Islam. So there's some of that historical side, and then I turn back to a theological consideration of the Quran's interest in Christianity. And to give the end away at the beginning, the argument is that the Quran, that Christianity is a conversation partner for the Quran, and that even in those sections of the Quran that do not deal explicitly with Jesus, Christians, or Christianity, that the Quran is formulating its own ideas, and in particular its theological ideas, with Christianity in mind. Hope that's somewhat articulate, and we'll see if you're convinced at the end. Okay, so 4 parts to this presentation. First, Christianity and Islam's emergence. I'll cover some of the traditional ideas and then I'll speak about Christianity in the Quran, and then the historical bit, Christianity in late antique Arabia, and then the last part is the argument that I already introduced, the Quran's theology and Christianity. Okay, so to start with the first bit, there's a quotation there from Richard Bell from his Origin of Islam in its Christian Environment. And more or less what I'll be speaking of in the traditional ideas is the notion of Western scholars, especially in the early 20th century, who built an idea around Christianity in the context of the Quran, that it was on the margins of the area in which the Prophet preached. So certainly there was no real Christianity to speak of in the Hijaz, the areas around Mecca and Medina. There were Christians on the fringes of the Arabian Peninsula in the north and south, across the Red Sea and over towards the Persian Gulf, but not in the area in which Muhammad was active, except for a few individuals whom Muhammad met, either because of his travels or because they happened to wander into the Hijaz. And there's a larger idea that the area around Mecca and Medina, the Hijaz, was somewhat of a pagan island in a Christian sea, in the Christian sea of late antiquity. So when I mentioned these individuals whom the Prophet is considered to have met, the typical names are Bahira, Waraqa, and the Najranis. There are some others. For example, we could speak of the first migration of Muslims to Ethiopia. Muhammad was not among them, of course, but Muslims there would have met the Christians in Ethiopia. But you may know the story that in Muhammad's youth, he traveled with his uncle Abu Talib to Syria, and there he was discovered by a Christian monk by the name Bahira or Buhaira. There are numerous Islamic traditions about Bahira. There's also an interesting literature of Christian counter legends about Bahira, which are much more extensive, in fact, go into much greater depth of the relationship between Bahira and Muhammad. And then there's the character known as Waraqa bin Nawfal that we find in the Prophet's biography, who sort of mysteriously, we hear from Ibn Ishaq, the standard biographer, was a Christian who had known the scriptures, both the Torah and the Gospel. And I say rather mysteriously because the Sirah doesn't give us the sense that there was a Christian community in Mecca. We just have this story that when the Prophet had his first revelation, he was comforted first by his wife Khadija, who affirmed him and the authenticity of his experience, but also called on her cousin Waraqa, who said, holy, holy, verily by him in whose hand is Waraqa's soul, etc. You can read the rest of the quotation. This reference to the namus, probably related to the Greek word nomos, meaning law, which once came to Moses and now has come to Muhammad. As with Bahira, the sort of literary role of Waraqa is to confirm the prophethood of Muhammad and the authenticity of his revelation. Christians play this role generally, whereas in the Sirah, Jews tend to play the role of stubborn, hard-hearted rejectors, although few Jewish individuals are said to have converted to Islam, but for the most part, the Jewish community, particularly in Yathrib or Medina, plays the role of the stubborn, hard-hearted rejectors. Waraqa also is a bit mysterious because this is basically his role in the Sirah. He is there to confirm the Prophet and he more or less disappears. I think if you read carefully Islamic literature, you can find a few reports here and there that later about his death in the later Medinan period, but generally this is all we hear about him. One other figure that I would mention is Salman al-Farisi in the Sirah, who's also sort of in this group of individuals. He, of course, embraces Islam and plays a role in the Medinan period in the biography of the Prophet. But he has a journey from Zoroastrianism to Christianity, to meeting a true faithful Christian in the sense of a proto-Muslim who encourages him to travel to the Hijaz, where the next prophet will come, and he meets Muhammad, recognizes him by the seal on his back, the seal of prophethood, which we could speak about if it's interesting. And then there's the community of the Najranis who have, so Najran, the city in the far south of present-day Saudi Arabia, who send a wafd or a delegation to Muhammad in Medina. And they also more or less play the role of confirming the authenticity of Muhammad's prophethood, because the prophet will challenge them to some sort of an ordeal. There's a brief debate that unfolds between the leader of the Najrani wafd and Muhammad about the divinity of Jesus. God intervenes and reveals some verses that, according to the traditional understanding, that are now in Surah 3. And then in the end, the prophet challenges them to an ordeal in which they will see who is the liars regarding their debate. And the Najranis basically acknowledge that they are wrong, Muhammad is right. But instead of converting to Islam, they agreed to become Ahl Dhimma and to pay a tribute to Muslims, and then they return on their way to southern Arabia. So, I mean, these traditional stories by Western scholars take these and they paint a picture by which there were just these scattered individuals that wandered into the Hijaz, whereas Arabia was largely pagan in at least the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. Here's some quotations from Bell, in which he says something like, well, you know, there's not much. He writes in the second quotation there that he never really accessed Christian scriptures, or one can imagine also Jewish scriptures. And so he writes at the end, the rest of his career in Mecca is characterized by his efforts to acquire knowledge of the contents of scripture, etc., etc. At the same time, Richard Bell and others, as we'll see, have the idea that the pagan Arabs were sort of naturally drifting towards monotheism. Bell speaks in a sort of poetic but probably wrong way of the creeping in of a dim, unmoralized idea of a superior deity, which was taking place among the Arabs. I mean, this is sort of like an effort through to understand the prophet's psychology and the social circumstances around him. That's maybe more typical of late 19th, early 20th century approaches to these sorts of things. So they ask the question, you know, where did Muhammad get this idea of God speaking to him? Well, the Arabs are sort of moving naturally towards an idea of monotheism. Hawting, I think he doesn't embrace this idea in the idea of idolatry. He's quoting earlier scholars who have this notion that there was an evolutionary path, that all peoples are moved from polytheism to monotheism, which I think among social scientists, anthropologists of religion and things in the 19th, 20th century was sort of the vibe. And so Hawting speaks about that. And these are sometimes combined with those passages in the Quran, like 29:61, in which the mushrikun, or the associators, that is the opponents of Muhammad, they acknowledge Allah. And there are actually many of these passages, at least a dozen of these passages, in which the opponents of Muhammad acknowledge Allah, but that either they acknowledge Allah along with their pagan gods or goddesses, or they don't devote worship exclusively to him, or they call on God only in times of trouble and not of other times. There's another idea among earlier Orientalists, which is that, okay, maybe Christianity was around after all in the Arabian Peninsula, but it was probably some sort of heresies. This is not really an academic scholar or an Orientalist, I guess, but the quotation was too good not to put in here. This is a guy named Spear. I don't know what the R stands for. R, some first name with R in it. And it's from a missionary conference among Protestant Christian missionaries working among Muslim peoples, the acts of which were later published. The conference was at Lucknow in India in 1911. And you can read the quotation there. I mean, in some ways, this is a very Protestant idea sort of the notion is that Muhammad must have met only heretics, because if he had met true apostolic Christians, he would have converted to Christianity and never invented, as they would see it, a new religion. It reflects sort of some Protestant notions about just Orthodox and Catholic Christianity, that it's all sort of debased. But also the idea that there might have been something even worse in Arabia, not just the principal ecclesial communities, which already are pretty bad from this Protestant perspective. Since Constantine, at least, things got bad, and there was all sorts of problems with rituals and worship and clergy and icons and veneration of saints and Mary and a million other things. But even someone sort of a more, sober scholar like Hamilton Gibb, I think Sir Hamilton Gibb, says, well, there was monotheism in there, but there must have been just strange groups. Behind this, friends, I think, is a notion that Arabia was just a sort of place where heresies and things would blossom, because it was behind the boundaries of the strict enforcers of orthodoxy in the Byzantine Empire. So that, I mean, the desert is just, if you're a heretic, you sort of run away from the Byzantine realms and go out to the desert and do your heretical things there. There's an old saying, which I've never found, I mean, sometimes attributed to different Byzantine historians like Theodoret, that, how does it go? Arabia Harasim Ferax, Arabia is the womb of heresies. So, I mean, that's sort of in there. This idea has not completely gone away, this portrayal. Now, in a much more sophisticated work, we have the ideas of Aziz al-Azmi. In his book, The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity, and is an incredibly lucid, sophisticated study, quite long, quite difficult to read because the writing is so technical. So it's of a completely different genre or character than some of the earlier quotations I've made. But nevertheless, Professor Azmi basically advances the idea that, as you can see in the quotation, that the Hejaz was a pagan island. He uses the word reservation, a pagan reservation, within the larger world of monotheism in the late antique Near East. And he even uses this phrase that it's historically retarded, meaning behind the times. That's sort of the story with Aziz al-Azmi. He also says that he acknowledges, of course, that the Quran engages with the Bible. And this quotation, actually, I agree with, when he writes, the Quranic biblicism did not amount to a biblicization of the Quran, but rather about the Quranization of biblical figures, fragments, and templates. So I agree with that in part, in as much as the Quran has a very heavy shaping role, or any biblical material that appears in the Quran passes through the filter of the Quran's theology and prophetology. So I think that's important. But for him, that is a sign of the lack of robust monotheistic communities in the Hejaz. And on that point, I would disagree. Okay, so it's not really a comprehensive study of traditional ideas about pre-Islamic Arabia and Christianity, but maybe there's some ideas. Some ideas which will at least form a basis for the next three sections. So section 2 is on Christianity in the Quran. I often put in these things, also for my students, images from this work of art that I just think is really intriguing. So this is the American Quran by an American artist named Sandow Burke. It's probably not super relevant to the talk, but anyway, it's neat to have an image here because most of the PowerPoint is text. Sandow Burke wrote out an English translation of the Quran by hand, and then accompanied that translation with images from American life, which are connected to the passage of the Quran, the corresponding passage in the Quran. So this is a cool one. This is from the cave, Surah 18, which of course tells the story of the sleepers of Ephesus, the 7 sleepers, or 8, that's a whole question, and their dog. But here, the American scene he's painted is of coal miners, one imagines, in West Virginia. In their mine has collapsed, and yeah, okay. So anyway, okay, on to Christianity in the Quran. I'll go through this relatively quickly. A whole talk could be given on this, or more than one talk. So this is just resuming some of the arguments I've made generally about the Quran being very interested in the Bible. Of course, when we speak of the Bible, I don't mean simply the canonical Bible. Also, it's important to note that the Bible, it seems, was not translated into Arabic at the time the Quran was proclaimed. And so we're dealing with a Bible in the lived culture of the people around Muhammad. But one sign that the Quran is really engaged and connected with biblical tradition is its integration of biblical turns of phrase. So this, I just find this super interesting. The Quran uses biblical turns of phrase in places where it is not quoting the larger biblical passage. But these just seem to show that biblical language and turns of phrase was in the air in the Quran's context. So here's a well-known one in Quran 7:40 about not entering paradise until the camel passes through the needle's eye. There's the corresponding quotation in Matthew. I think the saying is in all 3 synoptic gospels. So there's that. And interesting, this is not the time to go into this in depth, but in Islamic exegesis and in Christian exegesis, the same idea appears. I don't know what the story is, why this happens, namely that Jamal is not a camel, but is a thick rope, and usually described as a nautical rope. If I'm not mistaken, this precise description of the rope as being used for sailing appears both in Christian Greek writings on the synoptic saying and in tafsir on the Quranic saying. But okay, that's not the most important point right now. It's just sort of cool. All right, so another turn of phrase, qulubana ghulf, which appears in 288, also in 4155, which can be translated, our hearts are uncircumcised. So there's that. This is a very important motif in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I've just quoted from Stephen's speech in Acts, but it's already used by Jeremiah and other prophets in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes to condemn the Israelites themselves for being circumcised in the body, but not in the spirit or in the heart. So there's that saying. A couple more biblical turns of phrase. One is the Quran on 2 occasions uses the expression mustard seed, khardal, which is cognate with the Syriac in the Peshitta for the mustard seed. Again, it uses the mustard seed for different things than Jesus does in the Gospels. In the Quran, it's for the microscopic reach of divine justice, where it's used for the kingdom of God in the Gospels. Twinkling of the eye, maybe, I believe the phrase in Quran 16 is lamhat al-basar, which is more the quick glance of the eye. I forget, although I studied this once. I think in 1 Corinthians, the phrase in the Greek and probably in the Syriac is the blinking of the eye, but the King James rendered that as twinkling. So I'm not really, those may not be connected. I tend to think they are, but I could be wrong. And then there's this nice turn of phrase about forgiveness in 70 times. Different kinds of forgiveness are at stake in these 2 phrases. Anyway, I wrote an article on this, so I'm just like culling stuff that I put in the article. I think I speak about 10 biblical turns of phrase in that article. Here's another one. The apocalyptic scene involves the rolling up of the heavens or the sky like scrolls in both the Quran and in Isaiah and in the book of Revelation. And there are many others. There's the beast from the earth or the bear that appears in Revelation. Here's a really interesting one that doesn't deal with the New Testament that could be worth a longer discussion. This actually is a place where the Quran shows real knowledge, if you understand this actually as a play on words of Hebrew, because it uses this phrase, we hear and we disobey, sami'na wa asena, which seems to be a play on words on the Hebrew, wa shamanu wa asinu, apologies for bad Hebrew pronunciation, but it seems to be a play because it's taking a word that sounds like we obey or put into practice, I think literally do, if I'm getting that Hebrew verb right, and using a word that sounds similar in Arabic but has the opposite meaning, asena, which means to rebel against. But again, engagement with biblical language. Here's another one I didn't put up in the article, and if I'm not mistaken, there's a long article, I don't know if it's out yet, in Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam by Christian Lange on this, the afterlife of 1 Corinthians 2:9, this saying, which I think in 1 Corinthians is presented as a earlier saying. I think Paul is saying as it was written or as it is written, so I don't think Paul is claiming this as his own thing. Anyway, there's also a hadith about this saying, which is much, much closer to 1 Corinthians. And I now see that what I've done is made a mistake there. I've given you Quran 32 twice. So anyway, sorry for that. Look up 1 Corinthians. This is what no eye has seen, no mind has conceived, the treasures that God has in store for him, or something like that. Sorry about the mistake in the PowerPoint. There's probably other mistakes that we'll find as we go along. Not sure how I managed to do that. Okay, and then just 2 points about the turns of phrase. One is that with the exception of the Quran 293 bit, which I believe appears another place in the Quran, they're overwhelmingly Christian New Testament turns of phrase, and they're used for new theological points. So the Quran tends to use them in a different way vis-a-vis their original context in the Bible. Anyway, the larger point, and I could have just said this and spared you all of the details, is that the Quran uses biblical language, which reflects, in my opinion, a biblical culture and a biblical context. So is this the one I want to get to? Yeah, I'm going to go back to that. I'm going to go to this slide first because it's closer to biblical terms of phrase bit. So, I mean, another point that indicates perhaps the biblical nature of the Quran's context is the presence of Christian legends in the Quran. So the story of the prostration of the angels before Adam, which is connected to the fall of devil. I'm going to return to this point. Joseph Whitstone, many of you will know, wrote a masterful dissertation at Princeton University, still not published, but I believe publicly accessible. The dissertation is in which he shows how intimately connected, well, he goes through much more than the Joseph story. Actually, he speaks about Cain and Abel and many other bits, but the largest part is on the Joseph story. So it shows how intimately connected the Joseph story in Quran 12 is to the Christian tradition of exegesis on Genesis 37 and then 39 to 50. So, I mean, just to give one example, whereas Genesis has the brothers speak of a wild animal when they tell their story to Jacob about the supposed death of Joseph, the Quran speaks of a wolf, which is what Christians do, because they compare Joseph to a lamb, which is like the good shepherd biblical thing. So the Quran seems to be following Christian approach there. Also the story of the sleepers, which I introduced or I mentioned very briefly when showing you the image of Sandel Brooks' American Quran. This is an incredibly popular story in the late antique pre-Islamic Near East, exclusively, well, at least it's extant, I believe, exclusively in Syriac, although I think, according to Sidney Griffith, it was originally written in Greek, according to certain reports. So there's that. The Alexander story, which appears also in Quran 18. Anyway, you could go on and on. I wanted to give you just two quotations from two of these Christian legends. One is from the life of Adam and Eve, which is connected to the story of the prostration of the angels. A lot could be said about this, but the point is that the story of the prostration of the angels explains why Satan is out to get Adam and Eve, because it is Adam's fault that he has fallen from his high station. This explains a lot in the Quran, I think. I think a real key to understanding the Quran's theology and anthropology is the presence of Satan and his fall from heaven. So there's that. And then there's a quotation from Jacob of Saruk on the sleepers, which also, like the Joseph bit, uses the metaphor of Christ as a good shepherd, the faithful ones as sheep, and the enemies as a wolf. In Jacob's case, on the sleepers bit, the wolf is the Emperor Decius, which we could speak about more. Okay, now I'm going to back up. I think I just put these out of order. A larger point, and this is something I will return to, is that another sign of biblical ideas in the Quran is the way in which Jesus is chosen to articulate Quranic theology and prophetology. So there are two quotations, one about theology in 5:117, and then one about prophetology in 61:6. I'm not going to dwell on this because I think I'm going to return to these in section 4 of the lecture. That may be the end of section 2. It is. Okay. I think I'm doing mediocre on time. I'm probably taking too long. It's 10:32 Eastern time. And I still have 2 sections to go through. So yeah, we're probably a little over halfway through, though. I think these 2 sections are a bit shorter. Okay, so now this bit is meant to show why it's, or just shed more light on the Quran's interest in particularly Christian things, because more and more inscriptions in pre-Islamic Arabia suggest that Christians were around in Arabia. This is pretty profound and important sort of new development in scholarship on Islam's emergence. Just the inscriptions are more and more pointing to the presence of monotheists in 5th and 6th century Arabia, and especially Christians. And the great thing is that, from my perspective, is that corresponds with the interest in Christianity in the text. So it just fits. It's what we would expect to find. Okay, so this is a quotation from Quran 16, which probably, it depends on how you understand Ajami, which is rendered here as barbarous. I think it means non-Arabic language. And if I had to choose one, I would choose Aramaic. So it points to someone who was suspected of being Muhammad's informant. And then the Quran's response is, oh, but he speaks another Ajami language. Some people think it means just he speaks poor Arabic, but this is good Arabic. But I think other citations of the Quran show that Ajami means non-Arabic, not just bad Arabic. Okay, so this probably should have been in the previous section. I probably should just, oh no, the next part of the slide actually is important. So you can look, if you want, at the left side of the screen, which just has more examples of biblical vocabulary in the Quran. That probably should have been in section 2. This slide is basically about bilingualism in the Quran. The point of these terms is that not only are they connected to the Bible, but they seem to be, this is complicated, right? Because now people speak about the etymological fallacy. Walid Saleh wrote an article on that idea. But for different reasons, we might see that either in the Prophet's time or at an earlier time, these entered into the to Arabic and were used by the Quran to express ideas connected to the Bible, for the most part. And the reason why you think that, I mean, some are easier to explain than others. I think, Iblis is pretty clear. Tawra is pretty clear. Shaitan, although some people want to, the philologists want to connect it to an Arabic root. Nasara, yeah. Hawariyun is an interesting one because the root in Arabic means white. And so the Mufassirun sometimes say that the apostles, who are the Hawariyun, wore white clothing or they were bleachers of garments. But in Ethiopic, Hawariya is used for the apostles, which is how the Quran uses it. I'm sorry, I don't have the English translation of these words. Iblis is devil, Shaitan is Satan, Tawra is Torah, obviously, Injil is gospel. Nasara, Christians, Ma'idah, table, Hawariyun, apostles, Ahbar are the Jewish scribes, rabbis. Asatir are stories, and Sijil is some sort of sign. Okay, and it's just interesting to note that we have many bilingual Aramaic inscriptions. So the Quran is not really doing something unusual in integrating non-Arabic vocabulary. This had been done before. Many inscriptions are bilingual. And here's a nice example from Ahmad Jalad in his article, Linguistic Landscape, in which he's put in bold there the Aramaic words. Also in the translation, he's nicely bolded the words which are translated from Aramaic. Okay, I'll just move on, sort of pause there and drink some coffee so people could look at the article. Okay, and then I'd like to speak about a couple of inscriptions. Here's one studied by Leila Name of Paris, I think. And it's nice because for the most part, the words can be made out, even for those like me who are not experienced at reading Paleo-Arabic. But here you see dhikr, al-ilah, for example. Those are pretty clear. And you can see the translation on the right. This comes from around the year 550 AD. And it includes some Aramaic. I believe the word for month is yarah, something like that. It's an Aramaic word, but most of the words are Arabic. And most importantly, it includes this cross. It includes el-ilah, which is typical of the Christian Paleo-Arabic inscriptions for referring to God, the God, and it also includes a cross. This inscription was found in the city of Dumat al-Jandal, which is quite far to the north of Medina. I mean, I think a straight shot from Dumat al-Jandal in Medina is about 500 kilometers, maybe a little bit more. So it's quite far. It's not in the Hijaz. It is in the Nabatean realm, the pre-Islamic Nabatean realm, where many of these inscriptions have been found. So there's one. Here's another one, down now to the south of the Arabian Peninsula. This was originally published and studied in Arabic by Al-Hajj in Faqas in an article entitled Naqsh al-Zabub. And then Ahmad Jalad studied this in his article, which may be published now in its final form. It's on its academia page, the Pre-Islamic Basmala. Okay, this is really interesting. I hope I won't get this wrong because I haven't reread the article recently, but this was found on a rock, so it's a graffiti on a rock, but it's not in the typical ancient South Arabian monumental script. I believe it's actually in the minuscule script. I do not know ancient South Arabian scripts or languages, so I'm just repeating what I remember from Ahmad Jalad's article. Al-Hajj in Faqas argued that this inscription, which you can see on the right, at the top right, included a pre-Islamic basmala, because you have in the name of God either La or Allah. It's hard to distinguish, and then Rahman, Rahman. So they said, well, it's basically Bismillah Rahman Rahim. This is not Al-Jalad's reading, and I don't want to go into that depth, but he argues that the first Rahman is Ar-Rahman, and the second Rahman is actually an imperative verb with if I'm getting this right, an object pronominal suffix. So he translates that as have mercy upon us. But still, he thinks it's significant that this South Arabian inscription uses La or Allah in addition to the typical South Arabian name for God, which is Ar-Rahman or Rahmanan, typically. And he suggests in the article that it may be an effort to combine the North Arabian, South Arabian ways of referring to God. I believe he dates this again to the 6th century. It was, I guess, Al-Hajj and Fakhas who dated it to the 6th century. Jalad, these are two snips from Jalad's article in which he connects both the second line and the third line to Psalm 90, which is really intriguing, and two verses close to each other in Psalm 90. So there's that. So monotheism in the north and the south. I mean, these are two representations of monotheistic inscriptions. What's really interesting is, with the exception of the ancient South Arabian languages, but in the north, all of the Safavidic scripts disappear in the 5th and 6th century, and all of our inscriptions from this period, because someone can correct me if I've got this wrong, I'm just trying to basically read Al-Jalad's work, are in Paleo-Arabic, so a form of late Nabatean script, which is recognizable as the Arab, what we know as the Arabic script. Robert Hoyland intriguingly says, it was an idea whose time had come, by which he means to write a scripture in Arabic, because already in the 5th, 6th century, we have the use of the Arabic script in these inscriptions to communicate monotheistic ideas. Here are two quotations from Jalad mentioning not only do we have these, this is a really important point actually, not only do we have these Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, but we also do not have any longer the pagan inscriptions. So pagan inscriptions disappear completely by the 6th century from the north. Okay, and I'll just go quickly through some of the more famous Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, but I recently had a chat with Ahmed Jalad from my YouTube channel, and he said, no, Gabriel, like, it's not only the ones people talk about, there are now dozens of Paleo-Arabic inscriptions and more being discovered every year. They are all monotheistic, and those that can be identified further are Christian. None have been found that are clearly Jewish. These are three in Syria: Zebed, Jebel Sais or Usais, and Haran, not the Haran of Turkey, the Haran of southern Syria. This is Zebed and Haran are bilingual. I think Zebed is trilingual with Greek. Haran has Syriac. They're the inscriptions that Christian Robin has studied near Najran, a place called Hima, which are in Paleo-Arabic, although they're in the south. And then most importantly, and this is sort of a bridge to the Hijaz, well, it's more than that because it's in the Hijaz, an inscription recently studied and published. The study was published by Haytham Sidki and Ahmed Jalad at a site called Dariya al-Zalala, which is only 75 kilometers from Mecca, so really in the heart of the Hijaz, very, very close to Mecca, which is not explicitly Christian, but the language it uses in its first line, the Ruba, Raka, and then the use of Rab for God. These are Quranic roots that are very well used in the Quran and also familiar to the Christian inscriptions and not to the pagan inscriptions. And then finally, I would just note that there has been some work in Dumat Agenda on a building which seems clearly to have been a church. And so that suggests that Christians were not just wandering in and out, but there were settled Christian communities, at least as far south as the Nabatean realm. Quran does have this very intriguing passage in 2240 where it speaks in defense of Sawami, here translated by Arthur Arbery as cloisters. It might mean just anything, it might just mean monasteries. I think a Soma is a cell. I think it comes from Ethiopic, I'm not sure. Churches, oratories is probably a nice translation for salawat. Sometimes it's translated as synagogues, however, and mosques. Okay, on to the, can I take another 7 or 8 minutes, Paul? Okay, So on to the last bit, which is the basic argument, which is, I mean, in light of what we've seen in the first 3 sections about the biblical nature of the Quran's language and the historical evidence which suggests that monotheists were around, what are the consequences of that for reading the Quran? So my argument is that the Quran, like all texts, is attentive in the articulation of its own ideas to its environment and its audience. In that, in a sense, you cannot fully understand, at least from a literary quality, I'm not making theological claims, but from a literary sense, you cannot fully understand the text without keeping in mind its audience. I think most people would agree that for books, like that's sort of a rule, that you have a triangle between Quran between book, intended audience, and the reader, a sort of hermeneutical triangle. So that I want to advance sort of this idea. I mentioned this earlier and went through it quickly, but Quran 61:6, I mean, is this an example? Obviously, it's a passage that deals with Jesus. Jesus is employed to predict the coming of Muhammad, at least as I see it, referred to as Ahmad. But it's interesting that the Quran speaks of Jesus giving good news of a messenger. Obviously the root bashara is used frequently, or bashara, the verb is used frequently in the Quran, but the bringing of good news may be a calque on the Greek evangelion. The same root is used in Christian Palestinian Aramaic, basara, to translate the word evangelion in the New Testament, Subusra or something. I'm not sure. I read it in a secondary source. I forget now. In Syriac, there's the swapping of the first 2 letters, which is very common. So sabara or sabar is a Syriac word for that is used for giving good news. Although I believe I said Peshitta for Christian Palestinian Aramaic. In the fragments of the Christian Palestinian Aramaic New Testament that we have, obviously it's not the Peshitta. The Peshitta just transliterates the Greek word evangelion, I believe, for the gospel. Anyway, the idea is, like, isn't it interesting? The Quran is having Jesus speak with this term of predicting a messenger. More maybe speculatively, but what I'm trying to do in this section is just to give some examples of the way the Quran's language might be shaped by an interest in a Christian audience. What about the Basmala? So I'm drawing in part from a medieval author known as Paul of Antioch, which we could speak about. He wrote a letter called, usually translated as Letter to a Muslim Friend, in which he says basically that the Basmala is the Trinity, or the Trinitarian invocation known from Matthew 28, in which was obviously the center of Christian prayer life, or an organic element of Christian prayer life. So he says, the Basmala, the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, is the Trinity. That's not what I'm arguing, of course, but there have been a number of studies, including by Angelica Neuwirth and Manfred Kropp, which have argued that it's not the Christian Trinity, it's not Christian, but it is a response to the Christian Trinity, is a tripartite formulation of God and his 2 principal attributes in response to Christian Trinity. And then also in the Fatiha, and riffing on Paul of Antioch, again, there's the phrase at the very end in which the Quran has the believer pray about Alladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayr maghdubi alayhim, wala ad-dallin. So 3 categories of people: those upon whom you have bestowed grace, those upon whom you are angry or your anger rests, and those who are lost. And Paul of Antioch says, this is an engagement, this is an interest in Christians, because they're the ones upon whom God has bestowed grace. And then you have the the Jews and the idolaters, representing the last two groups. He's probably thoughtfully flipping around an argument that's very common in tafsir. I mean, Ibn Jawzi has it in his tafsir, but it's all over tafsir, that the Christians are actually those who are lost. And again, the Jews are those upon whom there's wrath. And those upon whom grace has been shown are probably the earlier prophets. So anyway, but again, not channeling the Christianization in the Quran that Paul of Antioch would like to see, but is it possible that the Quran is indeed referring to Christians and Jews here in this passage? For what it's worth, the Jews are frequently associated with divine anger in the Quran, and the Christians are often reprimanded for their deviant doctrines in regard to God and Jesus. And then I would like to draw your attention to a recent article by our friend and colleague Paul in Mideo, just recently published. And I won't say much, maybe Paul in the Q&A or the debate afterwards can add something further, but I think there are really important insights here about the Quran's use of certain vocabulary. I mean, if we think of the Quran engaging with great concern on the biblical text and claiming for itself the proper interpretation of the text, some of the Quranic vocabulary begins to look different. So the key genre of literature in Syriac tradition in which the theologians of writing in Syriac are engaging with the Bible is the Memra or the Mimro, which are these this metered prose used most famously by Narsai, Jacob of Sarug, and Ephraim, and it's a way of engaging with the biblical text. So qawl and hadith are those sorts of equivalents of Mimra. I think it's a very important suggestion. And then Paul, drawing on the work of Guillaume D, also suggests that the way that the Quran uses vocabulary such as bayyana may be connected to the use of certain vocabulary like pushoko in Syriac. So the Quran would be demanding the authority, particularly for its prophet, to clarify what has been hidden in scripture. So again, a sort of exegetical quality to Muhammad's proclamations. And then there's that quotation there in French from Torandre, who wrote that book on the origins of Islam and Christianity, where he's basically arguing what I'm trying to argue, which is that the Quran, like all texts, is open to the world around it. And I would say more than open is articulating its own ideas in conversation or with an awareness and a concern for its audience. And so in order to fully appreciate its articulations, we need to sort of pass through the Christianity of late antique Arabia. I think this may be the last slide. Let's see. Yeah, last slide. Okay, that's good news for everyone. Last slide. So I wanted to give maybe two more examples of places that are not explicitly dealing with Christianity, which may actually reflect a concern for Christianity. And I thought I would just choose maybe the two most famous verses of the Quran. First, the light verse, Quran 24:35, which you can read there in Arabic or in English. It strikes me that the desire here to portray God as light might reflect a concern with the portrayal of Jesus as light in Christian tradition. Also, the connection of God and his ability to proclaim parables, which is down here at the end of the verse, might be a reflection of the connection of Jesus and parables. And then in a special way, the notion of God guiding whom he wills to his light may be a polemical engagement in light of the sectarian competition with Christianity in its milieu. And then here's another example, maybe, of Quran's concern with Christianity in Quran 2. This is the throne verse. First, with no sleep overtaking him. This is possibly a concern with especially Jewish, but also Christian ideas of the Sabbath. of God resting on the Sabbath, the portrayal of God's throne in a way that wasi'a samawati wal ard, that extends over the heavens and the earth, and he's not tired by preserving them. That is Allah having extensive dominion. Might be an articulation of ideas in response to Christian ideas about the Trinity or the divinity of Christ. And again, you have this idea of no one being able to intercede without God's permission, which might be articulated with a concern for Christian ideas of Jesus's intercession with the Father, even if that's not a strictly theologically accurate way of speaking of Christian theology. This is not totally new, this idea that we should be concerned with the audience of the Quran. In her major study on Quran translation / commentary, Angelica Neuwirth has a section where she regularly speaks about the speaker-hearer interaction. So you see that on the right. And then I don't know where to choose from, but it's just in biblical studies, it's sort of understood that you need to think of the audience always when thinking of the author and his arguments. So, okay, that's my thank you screen with a couple of shameless self-promotions. That's a picture of my shelf there. I do have a YouTube if you're interested, exploring the Quran and the Bible, which is a discussion with scholars. So thank you for your patience with me.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for this fascinating talk, which I'm sure has given rise to many questions. So I'm going to be moderating this next section. So please raise your virtual hand in the Zoom, and I will call your name in order. I think we already have a question by Dina Al-Umari, who wrote a question in the chat while Gabriel was talking. So maybe we can start with that one, and then we'll move on to Amina after. So yes, Dina, if you want to express your question orally, you can do so, or else I will read it out loud to everyone.
Okay, one second. Okay. Hello, everybody. Yes, I wrote it in the chat because I don't have my micro here, so I'm not sure if you can hear me very well. Well, thank you so much, Gabriel, for this very interesting presentation. And well, I was just wondering, because I heard before a lot of times here in the discussions and also in Münster and otherwhere, that there is an interpretation for the Injil as lecture, and that the Quran is not addressing a book when it's talking about Jesus and his message. It is talking about Jesus himself, and so the Injil means the lecture or the message of the prophet of Jesus. And this is also important because when we are talking about the Tahrif debate, so this would be a very strong argument to say that it's not a book. The Quran is not talking about a book, it is talking about this lecture. So I just was wondering, what do you think about this, or is it a possible interpretation? And yes, this was my question.
Great. Yes, thank you so much, Dina, if I may. Yeah, thank you for that important question. I have one or two thoughts on that. Maybe the first point is that when the New Testament authors use the word gospel, they don't mean a written text. So already Paul, in the letter to the Romans, for example, written about AD 58, maybe not really an expert on that stuff, speaks of the gospel. So he's writing before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He speaks of the gospel, by which he means the oral proclamation, the message about Jesus, not Jesus's words, but the message about Jesus. But then in late antiquity, I think, or others here may know more, I think Christians do use the gospel which they certainly use it for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they may use it generally for the New Testament. I'm not so sure about that. Maybe someone else knows. From my perspective, the Quran is, its use of Injil is probably best understood as modeled on its own understanding of divine revelation given to Muhammad. So I would agree with you, Dina, that, or with the idea that ultimately I think it is referring to the message or the lecture from the Quran's perspective. And that's principally because at the time the Quran is being proclaimed, the Quran itself is not a written text, but is an oral proclamation. Yeah, that's all I have.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, and next we have a question by Amina Mukail.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Gabriel, for your interesting talk. I would express that I am a big fan of your channel, YouTube, Quran and the Bible. And I always ask my student to watch your videos. I have just my students ask you to put sometimes a video in Arabic, because here in North Africa, English is not very used as language. I have a question about future. How we can explore the Quran as theology in engagement with the Christianity. How can help to have this dialogue, deep dialogue between Christianity and Islam?
Great, thank you so much. Shukran, Amina. Khaliliyaki, for this nice word about the channel and for the support. Yeah, thank you. So wonderful question about how this, what consequences it might have for Muslim-Christian dialogue. I maybe one or two thoughts on this. The first one is that it shows us that Christianity and Islam, their story, I mean, also Judaism, and probably others will comment on this, that I haven't spoken much about Judaism, but Christianity, Islam, their story begins from the very beginning of Islam. But I don't think we can look at the engagement of the Quran with Christianity or the earliest Christians with the Quran and simply say, oh, the true story is that the Quran was always a friend to Christianity, or Christians were always a friend to the Quran. I think we have to be very sober about this, that this was a very ta'ifi, sectarian environment. And the social environment too, obviously, especially in the Medinan period, where you have the building of a state and conflict between communities. So personally, I wouldn't say we can say that, look, the people, so this is done sometimes in Muslim Christian dialogue, right? People say, oh, the first hijrah was to Abyssinia or Ethiopia. And the Christians welcomed the Muslims, so we should be friends now. Or the Wafd of Najran, Muhammad allowed them to pray in his mosque. Maybe you know this story, that the Najranis prayed in the Prophet's mosque. So stories are told like this. The problem with this approach, I mean, in my opinion, is that there are other examples too of violent conflict and polemics. So unless you want to just tell one side of the story, I don't think the approach is sufficient. I would say, to me, the best kind of dialogue, and I am interested in theological dialogue in addition to historical critical study, the best kind of dialogue is disagreeing well, just understanding a text as much as possible in its historical situation, appreciating its own strategies, its own theology, its own view, keeping separate the Christian theology, keeping separate Quranic, Islamic theology, and just doing very careful studies. Instead of trying to meet in the middle, keep some distance, but learn to love and respect the other.
All right, and our next question goes to, it's from Abdullah Galadari.
Well, thank you so much, Gabriel, for a wonderful presentation as
Hi,
usual.
Abdullah.
Good to see you.
Good to see you
Um,
too.
I have a question about who do you think perhaps the Christians of the Quran are? Because you said a very good thing. You basically said that heretics love to go to, the desert because they would be away from, of like their official orthodoxy, whatever they are. And that's very important to understand because we do realize the Byzantine church and the Syriac churches were up in the north from the Hijaz. And it seems from the Muslim tradition that at the time, Muhammad had known about the Byzantine church, sent them an emissary, and even talked about the Arians in his emissary to the Byzantines. He also, according to the
That's
Muslim...
disputed, isn't it, Abdullah?
Of
That
course,
one
I mean,
word?
yes, al-Irrisiyun, of course,
Yeah.
nobody knows exactly, but it might be the area.
Okay.
But nonetheless, I mean, you've got in the West, you've got the Coptic church, and according to Muslim tradition, Muhammad married a Copt. And the South, you had the Ethiopic church. And in the West, of course, you had the Church of the East, which many people call the Nestorian church, though that's also a misnomer. And so if I think about it, what do you think of this? Because everybody, almost every, different church had its own territory, even though they had different theologies and Christologies. But one big debate that existed during the 7th century, before the time of the emergence of the Quran, and even after the time of the emergence of the Quran, one of the reasons why many of the ecumenical councils existed was the monophysites. At least even the Arians, were up there with the territories and with the Visigoths at the time of the 7th century. So they even had their own territory. But the only, theology, Christian theology, that had no territory were perhaps the monophysites. Do you think they were in Arabia at the time?
Great reflection. Yeah, thank you so much, Abdullah. Thanks for coming. Shukran. I actually mentioned, this is a bit embarrassing, but I actually mentioned the idea of heresies being Arabia as an example of an approach I disagree with. So I tend to be very hesitant about that idea. I think this thinking, and he's a great scholar, 100 million times better than I will ever be, but Irfan Shahid represents this tendency of scholarship, which is that there was lots of Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula, but it was not, it didn't represent the principal ecclesial communities, which you mentioned. So the Church of the East, the Jacobites, or the Melkites. I respectfully disagree with Professor Shahid about this. I think that notion is based in part on a caricature of the religious situation in Byzantium. Others will probably know better than I do, but my understanding is that there was an uneasy coexistence between the ecclesial communities within the Byzantine Empire, and that it was carrots and sticks were constantly being used by Constantinople to try to draw back the Jacobites in particular, or Miaphysites into the realm. So I also think that the idea of heresies being around is based on a certain reading of the Quran. I'm not sure how you think about this, and maybe I'll just say this and then give you a chance to respond. Because, I mean, there are lots of scholars, Jeffrey Perrinder is a good example of this, who wrote his book, Jesus and the Quran. They look at, for example, the crucifixion verse in the Quran, and they say, oh, the Quran denies a crucifixion, so there must have been Docetists around. Muhammad must have been a Docetist. Or they'll note the apparent denial of the divinity of Mary, not Jesus, of Mary in the Quran, in verses like 5:116, but also earlier in the same surah. And they would say, oh, there must have been Mary worshippers around. And then Perrinder, but many others refer to a line in the heresiography of Epiphanius, that there were these Collyridians. You probably know this story. So I feel like scholars, whenever they see something that deviates from what they expect to find in regard to Christianity in the Quran, they're like, oh, there must have been some heretical group that's behind this. I am very suspicious of that approach. I want to say one more thing, but did you have a response to that or thoughts on that?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. And then my last thought is, while I would deny that I mean, the problem with heresies is, I think, but others here will probably know better, like the early Jewish Christian Ebionite, Elkazite heresies, I mean, even for the most part, Arianism, they're just not around anymore in the 7th century. Manichaeanism is, so is that Christian? I don't know, probably not, but they claim Christ. So yeah, it just seems to me, okay, so my approach would be, what could explain some of the turns of phrase in the Quran is just keeping in mind, and Guillaume D has written about this, the difference between the official theological take or expression of Christianity and the simple believers, as Jacques Danus puts it. You know, when Jacques Danus speaks in his really great book about simple believers, he says at one point in the book, he's like, to do theology for Christians and Muslims is like playing someone's sonata. Schumann, Bach, I don't know who writes sonatas. So he uses some example. He's like, it's not easy. You have to be an aficionado. And so on a popular level, when people are trying to express theological ideas, I mean, even today, even me probably, but I see it a lot among my undergraduate students at Notre Dame, when they're trying to speak about theological ideas, like it's kind of interesting. So does that make sense, that idea? Do you have thoughts about that, Abdullah?
No, that's perfect. Just wanted to know your thoughts. So thank you so much, Gabriel.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great, thanks. So next question is from John Tolan.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel, for your presentation, and
Thanks,
look forward to welcome you back to Nantes soon in May.
Thank you.
And I wanted to just, first of all, I thought was a very nice presentation of these different arguments showing the presence of Christianity from archaeology, from inscriptions in Arabia, pre-Islamic inscriptions, and from the use of biblical turns of phrase in the Quran. And I would maybe add another one, and this comes from a recent discussion with Ali Amr Moezi, who was talking about the narrative structure of the Quran. You know, this is something that a lot of European Christian authors since the 12th century have criticized the Quran as being disorganized, and you don't have, you know, the whole story of Noah at once, or the whole story of Abraham or Mary and Jesus, but you have bits and references. And this, for Ali, was a clear proof that the people who were listening to Muhammad knew these stories. So he didn't have to tell them the stories. He could refer to them and say, you know what, you know, the story of Noah and the ark, and, you know, if you don't listen to me, you're going to have the same thing happen to you as happened to the people of Noah. So clearly this shows that contrary to sort of the myth of a completely pagan Mecca, and you see this both in the Meccan surahs and the Medinan surahs, clearly the people who are listening to Muhammad knew these stories already.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, John. Thank you for coming. And interesting to hear that Professor Amir Mazi articulates that argument. Yeah, I agree with it. The references to biblical characters are very early, according to the chronological arrangement of the Quran. There's a reference to, there's references to Moses and Pharaoh in the very earliest. I mean, I'm sort of skeptical of the chronology, but even if we follow the chronology, the very earliest Meccan surahs, and then the surahs that have the longest biblical engagement with biblical prophets, like 7, 11, 26, 37, 54, also 28. I mean, they're all Meccan. And so from a very early period, that's the interesting point, that Yeah, in pagan Mecca, and so why would you be so concerned to articulate ideas with reference to biblical figures if your audience were pagans who only cared about the pagan goddesses or something like that? So yeah, I think that's a really important point. I often use the example of Jonah to articulate this, so less well-known biblical figure in the Quran, but the Quran has just like a handful of verses on Jonah. Actually, Job, you could do it with Job too, I think in Surah 38. Jonah, there's about 7 verses, something like that, in Surah 37. There's also a surah named Jonah, Surah 10, but there's only, I think, 2 verses on him there. And he shows up, I think, in Surah Al-Anbiya 21. But I mean, you really cannot tell the story of Jonah on the basis of the verses alone. And when the Mufassirin do, when the exegetes do, they end up, because of the way that it's articulated. So, for example, there's a line in, I believe it's in Surah 21, where it says Jonah went away angry. And to me, it's pretty clear that the Quran is speaking of the departure of Jonah from the land of Israel or Canaan on the boat on his way to Spain. And he's angry that God wants him to go on a mission to Nineveh to warn the enemy of Israel about the coming destruction. But there's no context to make that clear. And so the Mufassirun usually say he went away after he had already gone to Nineveh. And the people had repented and God was going to forgive them. And he had actually predicted the destruction, so he was made to seem a liar. And then it's after he goes to Nineveh that he's swallowed by the whale, which is kind of problematic because Nineveh is way up in northern Mesopotamia. Where was this whale? Was it in the Tigris River or the Euphrates? Anyway, so, but you can read the Quran very much in concert with the book of Jonah when you know, but you have to know the book of Jonah first. Anyway, it's just another way of saying that I agree with another example of that. Yeah.
Thanks.
And next question from David Gyllenhaal.
Hey, thanks very much for this talk. I agree almost totally with the outlines of your argument and have for a while. And so I wanted to ask you about things that continue to sort of bother me, specifically in relation to the early Islamic literary tradition. So I kind of want to ask a pair of related questions. The first is, what kind of impact you think sort of the political circumstances of the earliest crystallization of Arabic writing had on our ability to access a sort of Christian milieu for early Islam? So just the fact that by the time that we're getting Arabic literature in bulk, the Abbasids are in power, and we tend to get it filtered a bit more through places like Basra or Kufa or Fustat, to some extent at the expense of Assyrian milieu, and Medina as well. Like that can be overstated, but it seems like Assyrian milieu is sort of comparatively underrepresented in what we get. So my first question is just sort of, what kind of impact do you think that has on our ability to access like Christian currents in the earliest Islamic environment? And my second question is, why does the Sira Maghazi tradition seem invested in having Jews be Muhammad's sort of primary Abrahamic interlocutors? Again, that's something that you could overstate, but if you read through sort of like the Sira Maghazi literature, there seems to be a lot invested in Jews being sort of more relevant to Muhammad's context than Christians. So why is there an investment in that? Why would Sira Maghazi authors have that kind of commitment or investment?
Do you mean, David, because there were more Christians around in the Abbasid period in Iraq, for example, and so they would be more naturally given the role of opponents or adversaries? Or
In some, no, I mean, in some sense, I just don't understand. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on which would strike a Basran or a Kufan scholar as a more likely interlocutor. I don't understand why the Sira Maghazi tradition seems so heavily invested in foregrounding Jews at the expense of Christians. And I just wondered if you had any like notions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, David. My good to meet you through this. My on the first point, I don't think I have a really good answer. The Sira is extremely, is extremely delicate territory because there are, there's the legacy of the work of Patricia Crone and Jez Hawting and Andrew Rippin, for what it's worth, who in different ways, and certainly John Wansborough, who in different ways saw the Sira as a literary construction. Herbert Berg has continued this line. I'm sympathetic to a lot of what they say, and I'm sympathetic to the idea that Mecca is presented as sort of a pagan city because it advances in the apologetics that can be made by having Muhammad not dependent on a Jewish Christian community, in the lines of Abraham being a natural monotheist, being called out of the pagan lands of Ur or Haran in Genesis 12 or 13. So I'm sort of sympathetic to that, and it does seem to correspond to me with the emphasis on the doctrine of Muhammad's illiteracy. So you have this sort of background where he has no reasonable way of getting information from Jews and Christians because of the nature of Mecca and his illiteracy. That's a very interesting point about the geographical origin of the authors who are writing in the early Abbasid period. I think Ibn Ishaq himself starts in Medina but goes to Iraq. But the other sort of counterpoint are the careful work that people like Fred Donner and more recently Sean Anthony have done. Muhammad and the Origins of Empire, I think, is Sean Anthony's book, where he says, no, if you read through, and in part basing themselves on the Isnad Kamatan method, if you read through like big like Abd Razak and other collections of reports, you can get to real documents, some of which, I mean, Zuhri is in Syria, and we don't have obviously a text from Zuhri, but it's just, I haven't mastered this literature because it's complicated. I heard someone, or I saw someone announce on Twitter recently, a book by Musa ibn Uqba. So this is like very, very early 8th century. I didn't study it. I don't know if it's just actually a collection of quotations from later works. So yeah, sorry, that's not very coherent, but I don't have anything really good to say about that. In terms of the Sira Maghazi and having Jews as interlocutors, I mean, my temptation in thinking through that is it is a continuation of the anti-Jewish rhetoric in the Syriac Christian tradition. The unfortunate quality of this, in many ways, very beautiful literary tradition is that advancing the Syriac Christian authors, including the great heroes and saints of the tradition, like Ephraim, they advance their arguments by speaking of the hard-heartedness of the Jews who weren't able to see the obvious signs of Christ in the Old Testament. And I think this appears in the Quran in different ways, for better, for worse, in the theme of the Jews as killers of prophets and other things. And then this is built up in the Sira Maghazi literature. I mean, already there's so many reports in Ibn Ishaq of Jews who knew that Muhammad was a prophet, but when he actually appeared, where they knew a prophet was coming from Mecca. They even pointed that direction from Medina, but when he actually appeared, they refused to accept him. So I would say, I mean, why would they pick up on this in the Abbasid period? I think it follows a sort of salvation history in which the Jews were the opponents of their own prophets. They were the opponents of Jesus. They were the killers of Jesus, according to this way of thinking, obviously not historically. And then they were the opponents of Muhammad. So I would probably see it. Yeah. Do you have further thoughts, or would you respond to that?
No, I think that's actually a very compelling idea, basically, that in a sense, the very tendency to see Jews as better, more productive, more convenient opponents is itself kind of an indirect marker of a debt to the Syriac tradition, an abiding debt to the Syriac tradition. So that's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next up, a question by Shlomo Zukir.
First of all, thank you very much, Gabriel. It's good to reconnect in this forum. And
good to see you here, Shlomo.
And I enjoyed the paper a lot as someone who's very much a non-specialist in this area. I'm just sort of picking up on David's question just now, and on the direction of your talk that showed that and argued there were more parallels or more cases of influence from Christian sources than Jewish ones. So just of some of the examples you gave of different phrases, a couple of those we do have Jewish parallels as well, such as the mustard seed. That's commonly used in rabbinic literature. The phrase about an eye never saw, or similar things in a messianic context. There's a Talmudic passage on that. Obviously, the story about accepting the Torah, and the threat, the mountain over the head. There's a parallel between a midrash and the Quranic passage. That's actually in David and Katarina's paper and elsewhere. These are a few sporadic examples. Actually, one other thing that I hope I'm allowed to mention this, David, Gyllenhaal and I are working on, where there seems to be a pun made between the term for sin and the term for wheat in the Quran, and you write about it a bit in your Quran in the Bible, which we have the same pun in the Talmud, so those are just a few sporadic examples.
Can I ask how that works, Shlomo? I know I've written something, I've forgotten what I wrote. Hetta is the word, right? Hetta.
Yes.
And in
yes,
Arabic, henta is wheat. How does it play out in Aramaic or Hebrew?
So in Hebrew, the word that there's Babylonian Talmud has a pun between the word chatat, meaning sin, in the Cain and Abel story, and because the word sin is used there, it argues that the forbidden fruit, or the tree of life earlier in Genesis, is actually wheat, because it's chita, which is similar to chatat, to sin. So it makes that same pun as one of the ways of interpreting that Quranic passages. Happy to get you more details. We're working on this piece on it. But I guess the question is, if there are some parallels there, and also just considering the nature of the materials we have, where we basically, the only thing we have from this time period that we can place nearby is the Babylonian Talmud, which is admittedly a huge corpus, but it's one corpus. It's not like you have all of these different homilies from everywhere, and you can trace back to the Hebrew Bible, and and that's obviously, that could trace through Jewish hands or through Christian hands, and that's centuries and even millennia earlier. So the question is, were there other, is it possible there were other Jewish trade-ins, people telling different stories about the Bible or other things, or the influence of having a religious legal system, whatever you want to call it, and maybe we can find some traces here, but because the denominator, so to speak, is smaller, we should give more credence to a smaller numerator. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that question of the relative influence or impact, or conversation partner being Jews as opposed to Christians for early Muslim literature.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. I think, Shlomo, there's also something about the camel in the eye of the needle in the rabbinic writings?
Yes.
Maybe involving an elephant?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Some of those have been pointed out to me, and I think I was hasty in publishing the article because people have rightly reprimanded me and said, no, you haven't looked enough at the Jewish sources. So yeah, I think I have a lot to learn there too. So it's a really good point. And I mean, and some people responded to the article saying, well, you don't really get it, Gabriel, because the thing is that these are Semitic turns of phrase. They do not need to point to a Christian presence in the Quran's milieu, because, you know, in Jewish Aramaic and Hebrew, and as much as that continue to be spoken, and in Syriac, people are using forms of these phrases, like language is very fluid. These things are circulating between different Semitic languages. So yeah, you just can't isolate these as Christian turns of phrase. So yeah, I think that's a good response. I'm not totally sure the counter response. I mean, if I had to defend my point with some hesitation, not really enthusiastically, I would say, well, but the historical evidence we have so far from the inscriptions and what we know of Nebatea is that we have lots of evidence of Christianity being around. There is obviously Judaism in South Arabia. There's the Jewish period connected with Dhu Noas in the stories, which ends with the arrival. I don't know to what extent these are historical accounts, but the legend of the massacre of the Najrani Christians by Dhu Noas, and then the intervention of the Ethiopians who come in, and then Abraha by the mid-6th century is sort of establishing Christian domination. But anyway, there are definitely Jews in South Arabia. Robert Hoyland has written an article on Jewish inscriptions in North Arabia. So there are some inscriptions. They're harder to identify. They're not Paleo-Arabic. They're earlier inscriptions. So they're not written in the Arabic script, but these are different Safavidic inscriptions that will use a name which seems to be typically Jewish, or will refer to Israel. Yeah, I mean, overall, I think your point also about the Babylonian Talmud is very important. Yeah, I probably am going a little bit for the shock factor by emphasizing Christianity to this extent. But on the other hand, I think that this really is, I mean, Jews are minorities in the land, and the culture is profoundly Christian in some ways. And yeah, that's still my, I would say, my MO is to take that as a starting point. There really are places in the Quran that can only be explained with a reference to Hebrew, and not just Jewish Aramaic, but Hebrew. So one of which you mentioned is the Hitta passage. Another one is the Sami'na wa Asena, which is related with the one I mentioned in the slide. So we have heard and we have disobeyed, which seems to reflect, I think it's both in Exodus and Deuteronomy, a Hebrew saying from the Hebrew Bible. And then there's a famous bit, and this is maybe a little more tenuous, but where, I don't know where offhand, but where the Quran has tells his followers, Muhammad was told by God to tell his followers not to say Ra'ina, but instead to say Unzurna. And both of the words mean look over us, but Ra'ina, it could be a way of distancing the Quran from the Hebrew word ra, meaning evil, I think, and to use a word that cannot be misunderstood by Jewish audience. So, and then there's definitely material that's only understandable through, like, not turns of phrase, but actual material that's only understandable through a Jewish subtext. The one that comes to mind is the saying in Quran 5, around 32, which is something in the Mishnah, I think, not the Talmud, about whoever kills one soul, it's as though he's killed all souls. It's connected with Cain and Abel in Surah Al-Ma'idah. I believe it's in the Mishnah, it's connected with Cain and Abel as well. And it seems to be, there's a word in there, we'd have to look at the passage to make it really clear, but there's a word in there in the Quran, which is dhalika. And it's not clear, dhalika means that. And it's not clear what the that is. And the explanation could be that it's bridging the Cain and Abel material with the Mishnaic saying, by way of saying that, and that is the plural word damim used for bloods in Genesis 4 for Abel's blood, which is a plural, which, as you know much better than I do, I'm sure, led to, at least in one case in the Mishnah, the explanation that that when you kill one person, namely Abel, it's as though you've killed all the world or all of Israel. I forget. Maybe do you know, Shlomo, that
there are different textual traditions on that, but the original seems to be the world.
The world. Okay. So, I mean, all of which is basically to concede your point, and I need to enlarge my study of Jewish subtext and Judaism and Jewish writings like the Talmud in this context.
All right, we actually have questions by two Davids. I have a question by David Marshall, was first up, and then by David Nuremberg. So, David Marshall.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry, I couldn't raise a yellow hand, but I got your attention anyway. Hello, Gabriel. And,
hi, David.
Good to see you, and thank you for an enjoyable presentation. Gabriel, you'll be familiar with the area that I want to ask you about, but I thought it would be great to do so in this context and following your presentation, and maybe possibly for comment from others, from other colleagues. But I'd be fascinated to hear you comment on a sort of macro level aspect of the Quran in relation to relating it to the biblical context and the Jewish and Christian milieu of the time of the dawn of Islam. And that is the self-referentiality, the self-consciousness of the Quran as a scripture that knows itself to be a scripture, and that canonizes itself as scripture, in a way which, to use very broad brush language, oversimplifying, but the Bible, if one can speak in that generalizing way, of a library of books, broadly speaking, does not know itself to be a scripture and doesn't canonize itself. The community does that over a long period, and likewise with the New Testament. And yet the Quran does emphatically know itself to be scripture and canonizes itself from the word go, and does so repeatedly. So that aspect of the Quran, I suppose my question is, how would you contextualize that in the world out of which the Quran emerges? Do we find precedents in the Jewish and Christian milieu of that sort of idea? Are there movements in that milieu towards portraying the Bible or in that sort of way? Because that seems to me probably one of the most fundamental things about the Quran, and yet which is also perhaps most distinctive over against the early traditions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I won't say anything more about self-referentiality, because I heard you give a great paper on this topic in Rome. And in that talk, and others too, I mean, there's the work of Dan Madigan from around 1999, and then the work of Anne-Sylvie Bois-Livot in French, more recent on this topic. And it is, you rightly underline it as a major feature of the text, which distinguishes it from the Bible. There's an interesting correspondence even between the so-called mysterious letters of the Quran and self-referential phrases that follow immediately after that. So I'll say a couple of things, but I'd be really eager to hear others if they want to intervene. I don't know, Paul, if someone wants to make a comment specifically on this topic. I mean, one way to go with this is to say, well, because the Hijaz was a pagan island, the notions of the cessation of prophecy didn't take a hold there. And so you still had a culture where different figures, especially the Kohan, were claiming oracular speech, so divine speech, sometimes called mantic speech or something like that, I think, where, you know, the god, or maybe more like the jinni or the shaitan, is speaking through the kahin, the pre-Islamic Arabian priest. We really don't know much about if there were actually still kahins, pre-Islamic Arabian pagan priests or oracles. But anyway, I won't say too much more about that. That could be discussed. Muhammad is accused of being possibly a poet or a kahin in the Quran. So maybe that was a really real option. Maybe this way of speaking self-referentiality about divine God, like God is really speaking to me right now. These are not my words, these are God's words. Maybe that was a kahin way of speaking. That's usually not the approach I take. I would be more inclined to see the text in the light of the habit of the Syriac authors of invoking divine inspiration at the beginning of their memories, and others won't probably know this better. But I mean, for my reading of Jacob of Sarug, it's very common and I think almost a natural part of his homilies is that he starts invoking the Holy Spirit to strengthen him, speak through him. Now, in that context, I mean, everyone sort of agrees there's no more prophecy in the sense of revelatory prophecy, but there's a revolution that takes place with the Quran, where now you have someone claiming this sort of prophecy, bringing new scripture. But there are some precedents for someone not just bringing a commentary or a homily in late antiquity. I mean, notably Mani, I guess. But anyway, and then the other thing is, I think in some of the works of the so-called rewritten Bible genre, like Jubilees and Cave of Treasures, and there are probably others that I don't know well, even if they're not claimed to be scripture, I actually don't know if Jubilees claims to be scripture, but I think in the articulation of the idea they're written as scripture, or for the purpose of being scripture, in the sense of they're giving the account of God's saving work through Israel, or for the Cave of Treasures, through the prophets and the saints that lead to Christ. Anyway, that's all I got. Maybe others want to comment on this, or maybe David, you'd respond to that.
That was very helpful. The different strands you're pointing to, that's good. No comeback on that. Thank you.
All right, then. So, David Nuremberg, you're up.
I'd like to do three things. First, I'd like to thank you for not only a wonderfully informative, clear, and inspiring lecture, but also for this most generous way of answering questions, which is it's an example to us all. I hope to imitate it. And second, I want to apologize. I need to leave about 5 minutes early, so if I drop off as people are. And third, I want to ask a question, and I'm going to try display to my. I'm going to try ask a theological question, which is just an example of my my desire to impress my co-PI. That it may end badly. But I was really wondering about your use of the word theological in your title, because your talk is a brilliant example of what I would call more intertextual work, meaning you have shown us many influences, echoes, similarities across corpora, and you, of course, you've embedded them in a basic assumption made plausible by inscriptions that there are actual communities behind these intertexts. You tend to deny that more for the rabbinic, even though one could point to just as many intertexts for the rabbinic as for the New Testament, even more. I mean, the scrolls, just about every intertext you offered also has a rabbinic analog. But I just wondered what all of that tells us about theology. So if I took one example, and that is like the beautiful Satan example, and you offer us Life of Adam and Eve, which is fantastic. And there's no doubt, there's no doubt that there are intertextualities here. But I wonder if one couldn't push further towards the theological and try read these intertexts to understand some of the inner arguments that they're doctrinal arguments, we might say, that they're making. So for example, unlike the Adam and Eve passage, in the Quranic passage, at least in Surah 15, there's a very explicit remark that Satan makes. He says, "You led me astray in this way, and so I'm going to lead them astray in the same way by making beautiful things, making them go after beautiful things, created things." So just as God led Satan to worship and demanded that Satan bow before a created thing, which confused Satan, Satan will do the same to humanity. Now here you might see a critique of idolatry, of course, but also Christianity and image worship, if you want. I mean, but certainly there's content, there's theological content. And I guess what I'm asking is, how can we move towards that content? So not just from intertextuality, but actually towards the kind of interdoctrinal or communal doctrinal work. And that it's a naive question, but I ask it with genuine curiosity.
Thank you so much, David. That was really, it was a very profound question, in fact, and important reminder that I need to think through the question of theology. And yeah, in fact, although I'm in a theology department, my research habits have been basically to look at textual questions, and even then, in a sometimes simplistic way, not by looking at all of the sources as I should. And I'm certainly framed by my own background with more familiarity in the Christian context. So even my textual work is impoverished. So that, yeah, that's a really important reminder. In terms of the theology, yeah, brilliant point about the place of Satan. I would say maybe we could speak of low-key theological engagement with Christianity, which probably amounts to a sort of emptying out of the Christian dimension of certain narratives. And so this is material which is explicitly biblical when I speak of this low-key theological engagement with Christianity. And I didn't do much work on this in the talk, but the prostration of the angels would be an example of this, because this is a story which, for the most part, is a Christian story. There are in the Midrash different accounts which are connected to this. I mean, the larger theme of the resistance of the angels to the creation of humanity is also in Judaism. But the specific demand to bow down before Adam is really well loved by Christian authors, because it plays to something in Hebrews, I forget the line, but then also in 2 Philippians, which speaks of everything above the earth and below it and on earth, bowing the knee at the name of Christ. And so for authors, I mean, Life of Adam and Eve is very complicated, but it is preserved in different Christian recensions in different languages like Armenian and others. But Cave of Treasures, which is known to us in Syriac, is clearly a Christian text. And the author loves this story because it speaks to Adam as before his fall, as an anticipation of Christ, as the perfect image of God. But in the Quran, that's not there at all. So my reading is not that is not to Christianize the Quran, but is to notice for this category of theological engagement, the emptying out of Christian content. So this is a profoundly Christian story, another just for the Christians, but in the Quran, it's not. It's exactly, as you say, an example of why Satan causes us so much trouble. And it has to do with a desire for revenge. And we have these wonderful accounts where he speaks to God directly, asks for respite, and there are a number of other examples of this. I mean, the story of the creation of a bird from clay is for the infancy gospel is very important about Jesus because it makes an analogy of Jesus. It's an argument for his divinity because it makes an analogy to the way in which God creates Adam from clay and brings him to life through his breath, which is what Jesus does with the clay bird, but is emptied out in the Quran of any argument for divinity, especially because the Quran says he does this with the permission of God. So that would be Loki. And then there would be something that's more elusive, which would be ways in which in material that the Quran is, where it's not engaging with Bible or Christianity, it nevertheless, can we see a concern for its audience, which I'm proposing is heavily Christian in the way it articulates its own ideas. And this would be a more pervasive, my notion, though it's a little bit provocative and controversial, is that the Quran is seeped through with this interest in addressing the theological presumptions of its audience, in that the way it articulates this new prophet. I mean, sometimes it does say things like in Quran 9:111, it says that its view of martyrdom is written in the Torah and the Gospel and in the Quran, or it claims that Muhammad is written about in Quran 7:157 in the Bible. But then the reason why I put the light verse and the throne verse is even its vision of God, when it speaks of God, the divine names it gives to God, God as proverb maker, I think that's actually important. God as Allah specifically, and not Jesus as the one who guides and leads astray, who gives life and death. And then some of the anti-biblical attributes given to God. So, for example, not sleeping. That's not specifically Christian, of course. All of this is a more, I don't know what the opposite of low-key is, but a more thorough mindfulness of biblical tradition, and then sometimes I think explicitly responds to the Christian ideas about Jesus. Okay, probably went on too long, but yeah. Anyway, so I agree with you that I need to think through that more and consider more carefully what it means to have a theological engagement.
I think we all do. But that's one of the glories of your approach, is that it's also a foundation for new theologies that we aren't even aware of yet.
Thank you.
All right, and we have 5 minutes left and a question from Jillian Stinchcomb.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Dr. Reynolds. This was a really fascinating talk, and I'm really persuaded by, sympathetic to your arguments. My question is emerging from, I think, 2 strands. So one, of course, the consideration of a possible Jewish background to a lot of these traditions as well, which I think you've addressed quite adequately through various questions. Another element that has come to mind in this conversation is, at one point you refer, a bit glibly to like, oh, well, why would pagans care about the biblical tradition if they're really concerned with goddesses, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder to what degree your argument might be nuanced or shaded in some way if we imagine that even the non-explicitly Christian, what we might call like pagan others, also in the Hejaz environment, found the biblical past to be a source of power. And I'm thinking here about the Aramaic magic bowls, and how when you read those, there's this like, there's a total mixture of, Christian and Jewish, but also, pagan of various stripes traditions, that oftentimes the sort of simple believer, to use Jack Danus's formulation, or just, regular people, were not all that invested in, firmly being just Christian or just Jewish or something else, but they wanted to invoke the powers that would work for them. And so imagining sort of maybe I certainly believe that there were Christians in the audience and that the Quran is sort of attuned to that. I think you've argued that persuasively. But also, if there are other people in the audience who maybe aren't explicitly Christian in the same way, but also do believe that, say, Solomon, for instance, has power and therefore is like a powerful interlocutor to think with. Would that nuance or change your argument in your estimation if we consider basically that the power of the biblical past that the Quran is very much invested with is something that is powerful to not only Jews or even Christians?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really, really thoughtful reflection, but also encouragement for further nuance in thinking through these questions. My own tendency is to be very skeptical of the robustness of paganism at all. I am even tempted to think that when the Quran speaks of Minat, Alat, and Al-Uzza in the famous passage connected to the story of the Satanic verses, or in Quran, I think it's 71, where it speaks of the peoples in the time of Noah, and it mentions gods, which people, there's a series of 5 gods it mentions there, which people associate with gods not of Noah's time, but of Muhammad's time. I tend to see these as relics of a past that is no longer the present. This is tough. Nikolai Sinai is really careful and thoughtful in his introduction to the Quran in proposing ways of making sense of the references to associators, mushrikun in the Quran, but also with what seems to be the highly biblical context of the Quran. I tend to be more skeptical than him in terms of this biblical, in terms of the pagan, ongoing pagan presence. To me, it's almost a smoking gun that the inscriptions disappear. Maybe we'll find new pagan inscriptions. However, what I really need to learn about, and what you're really encouraging me to, is that even if I remain skeptical about that, I would love to begin to understand better the nature of popular religion. And I mean, like most students of early Islam, I think, I rely on the text. I think about the text, and there's a whole world. And I think maybe this program that Katerina and others have organized is getting just at that point, that what we read in the text may not correspond with the lived religion in the ways in which there are intertwined traditions, texts. Maybe I'll just leave it there. I think I've got a lot to learn about it.
We have 1 minute left, and David Gyllenhaal, if you want to ask a question in about 10 seconds, and Gabriel, you want to answer in less than 50 seconds, that would be perfect.
It's actually not a question, it's a follow-up to Jillian. I just wanted to note there's a really rich vein of material in Syriac homilies, where basically the preacher will yell at his congregation for being pagans. And you're like, wait, are they pagans? And then it turns out, no, they're all Christians. They all call themselves Christians. He's yelling at them because they won't stop pouring one out for Venus when they're trying to have a baby. And like any of 100 different, practices which he identifies as pagan, and then he'll sort of move into a vein where he's like, how can baptism abide in a body that's polluting itself with all of these? So just to make the point that I think there's actually a really rich vein of material in Syriac homiletics that hasn't been exploited almost at all, which depicts Christianization as a perpetually unfinished process that the preacher is always really irritated about, because he cannot scrape his congregants out of, I guess, what you would call sort of technologies of ordinary life. He reads as still being pagan, but they read as just being what you do when you're trying to have a baby.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think that pretty much wraps it up for us. So I want to thank you, Gabriel Reynolds, once more for accepting our invitation and for this fascinating talk. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for their questions and this engaging conversation. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.